The weight of the key was unfamiliar in Elias's hand. A cold, iron promise he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. It had arrived in a plain brown package the day after the lawyer's call, accompanied by a single, typewritten line on a card. The stories are waiting to be finished. It is your inheritance. His great-uncle, Alistair Vane, had been a recluse of the most picturesque sort, the kind who inhabited a Gothic novel rather than a semi-detached house in a quiet suburb. But Alistair was gone now, found peacefully cold in his study, surrounded by mountains of books and the faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco and decay. The house, a looming Victorian edifice named Whisperwood, and its entire contents, now belonged to Elias. He stood before the heavy oak door, the key poised. The house seemed to watch him, its windows like hooded eyes. He'd only met Alistair once, as a child, and the memory was a blur of shadows and the feeling of being measured by a gaze that saw too much. Alistair had been a writer not of bestsellers, but of obscure, small-press horror collections. Elias, a copywriter for a tech firm, dealt in the sterile language of features and benefits. They were from different worlds. The lock turned with a groan that echoed through the silent street. The door swung inward, releasing a breath of air that was centuries old, smelling of dust, old paper, and something else. Something sweet and faintly rotten, like forgotten flowers. The interior was a museum of clutter. Towers of books leaned precariously against walls papered in a dark, floral pattern that had faded to the color of dried blood. Cobwebs draped from the crystal chandelier in the hallway, glittering like gossamer in the weak afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows. Elias's footsteps were muffled by a thick Persian rug, its patterns worn into obscurity. The lawyer had mentioned the collection. "Your uncle was most insistent," the man had said, adjusting his spectacles. He believed his final 3 stories were his magnum opus. "They are unfinished." He expressed a fervent hope that you might see them to their conclusion. Elias had laughed, a short, nervous sound. "I write about cloud storage, not ghosts." The lawyer's smile had been thin, devoid of warmth. "Be that as it may, Mr. Vane." It was his final wish. "The house is conditional upon you attempting the task. You must spend 1 month here with the stories. If you fail to make a sincere effort, the property and its contents will be bequeathed to another party." It was blackmail, pure and simple, but the kind a struggling, debt-ridden 30-year-old couldn't refuse. So here he was. He found the study at the end of the hall. This was clearly the heart of the house. A massive desk, carved with grotesque figures, twisting serpents and weeping faces, dominated the room. Behind it, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves bowed under the weight of leather-bound volumes. And on the desk, set apart with deliberate care, were 3 thick, handwritten manuscripts. Next to them lay a fountain pen, its nib gleaming like a black talon, and a bottle of ink the color of midnight. Elias sank into the worn leather chair. It sighed under his weight, as if resigning itself to his presence. He picked up the first manuscript. The title was written in a precise, spidery hand, "The Silhouette in the Smoke." He began to read. Story 1. The Silhouette in the Smoke. Arthur Pembroke was a man who believed in nothing he could not quantify. As the foreman of the Ashworth textile mill, his world was one of gears, production quotas, and the relentless, thunderous roar of the looms. The mill was a beast of brick and iron, perpetually exhaling a plume of gray smoke from its single, towering chimney, a smoke that stained the sky and the lungs of the workers alike. Lately, however, the quantifiable world had begun to fray at the edges. It started with the children, the urchins who played in the shadow of the mill. They had a new rhyme, one they chanted in skipping games, their voices piping and clear above the industrial din. "See the shadow in the smoke? Never laugh and never joke. It watches from on high, you see, for the one who'll set it free." Arthur dismissed it as nonsense. But then his workers began to report seeing things. A figure, they said, a dark silhouette that sometimes appeared within the billowing plume of smoke. It was a man-shaped void, impossibly black against the gray, and it seemed to be looking down, its gaze fixed on the mill. "It's just a trick of the light, soot particles coalescing," Arthur told his shift manager, Briggs, a superstitious man with a perpetual nervous tremor. "Aye, maybe," Briggs had replied, his eyes wide. "But it's been there for a week now. And the timing, Mr. Pembroke. The timing is bad." He was right. The machinery, so reliable for decades, had developed a peculiar affliction. The looms would, without warning, slow to a grinding halt, their rhythm broken. When inspected, the cause was always the same. The threads, strong cotton warp and weft, would be tied, not broken, into intricate tiny knots. Knots that resembled clutching skeletal hands. Production was falling behind. The mill owners were furious. Arthur stayed late one evening, determined to find a rational cause. Sabotage, perhaps. A disgruntled worker. He patrolled the vast, echoing floor, the giant, silent looms standing like sleeping titans in the moonlight. The air was thick with the smell of oil and raw cotton. It was then he heard it. A faint, dry sound, like twigs scraping together. It came from the far end of the hall, near the old, disused carding machine. He approached, his lantern casting a wobbly pool of light. There, sitting on the floor with its back to him, was a figure. It was small, perhaps a child, and its hands were moving with frantic, spider-like dexterity. It was taking the loose cotton waste from the floor and tying it into those same horrible little hand knots. "You there," Arthur barked, his voice echoing. "What is the meaning of this?" The figure stopped. It did not turn. Instead, it began to stand, its movements stiff, unnatural. It was taller than he'd thought, its limbs too long. As it rose, it turned its head, and Arthur saw its face. It wasn't a face of flesh, but of woven thread, a crude, featureless mask. And then it simply unraveled. The threads of its body loosened and fell to the floor in a heap, leaving nothing but a pile of knotted cotton and a lingering chill. Arthur fled, his rational mind shattered. The next day, driven by a feverish need for answers, he delved into the mill's archives. He found it in a ledger from 1882. An accident. A young, simple-minded worker named Eli, known for his incredible skill at knot tying, had fallen into the carding machine. His body was never recovered, ground into the very fibers of the mill's output. The foreman at the time had callously noted, "The boy is now part of the product." A minor loss. Arthur understood. The silhouette in the smoke was Eli's spirit watching, waiting. And the knots were a message. Eli wasn't trying to stop the mill. He was trying to complete his work, to be part of the process again, using whatever means he could. The ghost wasn't malevolent in the traditional sense. It was obsessive, trapped in the single-minded purpose of its former life. The story ended there mid-sentence. Alistair's last written words were, "Arthur knew then that the only way to pacify the spirit was to..." Elias put the manuscript down. His heart was thumping. The story was vivid, the atmosphere thick and claustrophobic. He could almost smell the oil and cotton. He looked at the blank page that followed, then at the pen. The obligation felt heavier than before. How would he finish it? He thought about the nature of the haunting. It wasn't about revenge, but about completion. Arthur, the rational man, would have to perform an irrational act. A ritual of acknowledgement. Elias picked up the pen. It was cold in his hand. He uncorked the ink bottle and began to write, the nib scratching loudly in the silent room. To give it a job. Arthur went to the owners, a difficult task for a proud man, and spun a lie about an old tradition, a forgotten right for the mill's guardian spirit. He convinced them to allow one loom, the oldest one, to be run for 1 hour each night, unattended, loaded with a special ceremonial thread. It was a ridiculous request, but Arthur's desperation was persuasive. That night, he set up the loom himself. He didn't use cotton, but a strong, pure white linen. As the clock struck midnight, he started the machine. The loom clattered to life, a solitary heartbeat in the silent mill. Arthur hid and watched. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, he saw the threads begin to move on their own. The shuttle flew, the harnesses shifted, but there was no one there. The loom was weaving by itself. And taking shape in the linen was not a pattern of cloth, but a woven image. A face, simple, peaceful, with a faint smile. It was the face of the boy, Eli, finally at peace. The next morning, the silhouette in the smoke was gone. The mill never had another mechanical issue. And on Arthur's desk he found a single, perfectly tied knot, made of the white linen. A token of thanks. Elias stopped writing. His hand ached. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, as if he had solved a complex puzzle. The house around him seemed a little less oppressive. He had finished the first story. The satisfaction was short-lived. As night fell, Whisperwood came alive with sounds. Floorboards creaked with the weight of steps that weren't his. A faint, melodic humming echoed from a distant room, a tune he almost recognized. The sweet rotten smell grew stronger. Trying to distract himself, he explored the house. In the library, he found a photograph album. Most of the pictures were of Alistair, a severe man with piercing eyes. But one photo caught his attention. A young Alistair, perhaps in his 20s, standing with two other men. They were all smiling, but it was a tense, challenging smile. The inscription on the back read, "The Three Chroniclers, Alistair, William, and Joseph. Brighton, 1965. William and Joseph." The names meant nothing to him. He tucked the photo into his pocket and returned to the study, feeling the weight of the second manuscript. Its title was The Hush in the Hollow. Story 2. The Hush in the Hollow. Eleanor Vance sought silence. As a composer, the cacophony of the city, the traffic, the sirens, the relentless human noise, had become a poison, stifling her creativity. When she inherited a small, isolated cottage from a distant aunt, nestled in a place called Stillwater Hollow, it seemed like a godsend. The hollow was a geographical anomaly, a deep bowl in the earth surrounded by dense, ancient forest. The moment she descended the winding path into it, the world's sounds vanished. It wasn't just quiet. It was an absolute, profound silence. No birds sang. No wind rustled the leaves. Even her own footsteps were swallowed by the thick, mossy ground. It was, she thought, perfect. The cottage was quaint and sturdy. The first few days were blissful. She arranged her few belongings, her piano, and began to work. The music flowed from her, strange and beautiful, inspired by the deep quiet. But soon she noticed the oddities. The silence wasn't empty. It was a presence. She began to call it the hush. It had a texture, a weight. It would press against the windows at night, a tangible force. And sometimes, within the hush, she would hear, not a sound, but the memory of a sound. A child's laughter, so faint it was like an echo from a dream. The crack of a twig, but one that had snapped 100 years ago. The hollow wasn't silent because there was no noise. It was silent because the hush had absorbed all the sounds that had ever been made there, digesting them slowly. Then the hush began to hunger for new sounds. It started with small things. The ticking of her clock would stop, not because it was broken, but because the sound had been plucked from the air. The strings of her piano would go dead, the vibrations dying the moment they were born. She felt a growing panic. The hush was leaching the world of audio, leaving behind a terrifying vacuum. One evening, she was playing a particularly complex passage, her fingers flying across the keys. She struck a high C, and the note simply vanished. It didn't fade. It was there, and then it wasn't. A wave of cold air passed over her. She looked up and saw it. A distortion in the air, like heat haze but cold and gray. It was the shape of a man, a shimmering void of silence. It was listening to her, and it was hungry for more. Eleanor tried to leave, but the path out of the hollow seemed to have shifted, the trees closing in, the silence becoming a wall she could not pass. She was trapped. The hush began to take more than just musical notes. It took the sound of her voice when she tried to scream. It took the sound of her heartbeat from her own ears, leaving her in a terrifying internal quiet. She realized the hush wouldn't be satisfied until it had consumed her completely, until she was as silent as the hollow itself. Alastair's manuscript ended as Eleanor, in a final, desperate act, sat at her silent piano and placed her fingers on the keys, knowing that the next note she tried to play would be her last. Elias put the pages down. His own ears were ringing in the profound quiet of Whisperwood. He understood Eleanor's plight. The hunger of the hush was a terrifying concept, a predator that fed on sensation itself. How could you fight silence? He thought about the photograph in his pocket. The three chroniclers. He thought about the nature of sound, of vibration. You couldn't fight silence with noise, because the hush would just consume it. But what about anti-sound? What about canceling it out? He picked up the pen again. The ink flowed smoothly. Eleanor's hands were trembling, but her mind was clear. She was a composer. She understood resonance, frequencies, harmonics. The hush was a predator, but like any predator, it must have a weakness. Consume sound, but what if she could give it a sound it couldn't digest? A sound that would make it sick? She thought of the stories she'd heard of infrasound, the low frequencies that could induce terror. But that was still just sound. She needed its opposite, a conceptual negative. She closed her eyes and thought not of a note, but of the absence of a note. She imagined the precise sonic void that would exist between two perfectly harmonious frequencies. She focused all her will, all her terror, all her love for the music that had been stolen from her, and she projected that absence. Her fingers did not press the keys. Instead, she pulled the silence from them. It was an act of supreme auditory imagination, and the hush reacted. The shimmering gray form in front of her convulsed. It was a vacuum being presented with a greater vacuum. It began to fold in on itself, the silence collapsing. A tiny point of sound appeared, like a pinprick of light in a dark room. It was the sound of a child's laughter, long ago absorbed. Then another, the crack of a twig, the song of a bird. The hush was disgorging its stolen sounds, vomiting them back into the world in a chaotic, beautiful cacophony. The gray form shattered like glass, and a wave of sound, a century of sounds, washed over Eleanor. It was deafening, glorious. The path out of the hollow was clear. She gathered her things and fled, her ears ringing, her heart full. She never composed again, but she lived the rest of her life in the comforting, mundane noise of the city, a symphony she would never take for granted. Elias exhaled, his own breath loud in the room. He had done it again. The story felt complete. But as he laid the pen down, he heard it clearly from the floor above. The distinct sound of a piano key being struck, a single sour note that hung in the air for a moment before being swallowed by the house's silence. The next day, Elias felt a growing connection to the house and to Alastair. The stories weren't just assignments. They were tests. Or perhaps they were invitations. He searched the library more thoroughly, looking for anything about the three chroniclers. He found it in a locked drawer in the desk, a small leather-bound journal. It was Alastair's. The entries were cryptic, but a pattern emerged. Alastair, William, and Joseph had been more than friends. They were practitioners of a kind of creative magic. They believed that stories, when crafted with true intent, could shape reality. They called it scriptomancy. They had made a pact to each write a story about a different aspect of fear, stories so potent they would become archetypes, foundational pillars of terror. But something had gone wrong. William, obsessed with the fear of the body, had delved too deep into his story and had been lost to it. Joseph, exploring the fear of the mind, had suffered a similar fate. Only Alastair remained, the chronicler of the fear of the soul, and he had been unable to finish his trio of tales, haunted by the ghosts of his friends and the power they had unleashed. The third story, Elias realized with a chill, was the key. It was Alistair's own story, and it was titled The Reflection in the Ink. That night, the atmosphere in Whisperwood changed. The friendly creaks became menacing. The faint humming was now a low, angry growl that seemed to emanate from the walls. The sweet rotten smell was overpowering, leading him to a room he had not entered before. An artist's studio. Canvas upon canvas were stacked against the walls, all painted by Alistair. They were portraits of the same two men, William and Joseph, but each painting showed them in a state of horrific transformation. In one, William's skin was peeling back to reveal intricate clockwork beneath. In another, Joseph's head was a cracked porcelain mask, leaking a black, tarry substance. These were not imagined horrors. They were records. Elias returned to the study. The third manuscript waited. His hands were shaking as he opened it. Story 3. The reflection in the ink. Alistair Vane was a prisoner of his own creation. He lived in Whisperwood, a house that was not just a building, but a living story. Every creak was a plot point, every shadow a character. He had spent his life weaving narratives of fear, and now, in his final years, the narratives were weaving him. The house was a palimpsest of his tales. The ghost of a mill worker from his first story sometimes manifested as a knot in the carpets. The predatory silence of the hush would sometimes pool in certain rooms, stifling all sound. But these were just echoes. The real problem was the ink. He wrote with a special ink, one he had concocted with William and Joseph all those years ago. It was made from midnight water, crushed obsidian, and a single drop of their own blood. This ink gave their stories power, but it also created a link. The stories lived in the ink, and the ink lived in the stories. Lately, the ink had begun to rebel. It would sometimes, of its own volition, form words on blank pages. Accusations, threats, snippets of stories he had never meant to write. He would see things moving in the inkwell, dark shapes swimming in its depths. He knew what it was. It was the combined consciousness of William and Joseph, their essences trapped within the stories they had created, now bleeding together into a single, malevolent entity. They were angry. They were lonely. They wanted him to join them. His reflection had begun to change. When he looked in a mirror, he would sometimes see not himself, but a composite face, William's mad eyes, Joseph's cruel mouth, all framed by his own aging features. They were pulling him in. The story he was trying to write, The Reflection in the Ink, was his last stand. It was to be a story about a writer being consumed by his own creation, but if he wrote it with the powerful ink, he would be literally creating the mechanism of his own destruction. It was a paradox he could not escape. The manuscript described Alistair's final days. His growing paranoia, his inability to tell dream from reality. He would see Joseph staring at him from the patterns in the wallpaper, hear William's voice whispering from the gramophone horn. The ink was rising, ready to claim its final chronicler. The story broke off mid-sentence. The surface of the ink in the well shimmered, and Alistair saw his face begin to melt away, revealing the grinning visage of Elias. Looked up from the page. The air in the study was freezing. The bottle of ink on the desk seemed darker than black, a tiny event horizon. He understood now. The sincere effort the lawyer mentioned wasn't about writing well. It was about finishing the ritual. Alistair had started the process with his blood in the ink. By using the same ink to finish the stories, Elias was adding his own essence to the mix. He was being auditioned. He was to become the new chronicler, the new soul to be bound to this house of stories. He didn't want this. He wanted his sterile life, his cloud storage copy. But as he thought of fleeing, the door to the study slammed shut. The shadows in the room deepened, coagulating into two distinct forms. One was gaunt and mechanical, its movements jerky, the essence of William. The other was fluid, its face a shifting mask of madness, the essence of Joseph. They stood between him and the door. There was no escape. He looked at the blank page. He looked at the ink. He thought of the endings he had written. They were about pacification, about understanding, about using the rules of the horror to achieve a resolution. That was his contribution. He didn't believe in the brutal, consuming horror of Alistair's generation. He believed in endings. He picked up the pen for the last time. He would not write a story of consumption. He would write an ending. Joseph. But Alistair did not scream. He smiled. He had finally understood. The ink wasn't a prison. It was a legacy. William and Joseph were not tormenting him. They were waiting for him. They were incomplete without the third. Their stories needed an ending. A true ending, not just an abandonment. He looked into the inkwell, into the swirling faces of his old friends. "I'm coming," he whispered. "But the story doesn't end with us." He dipped the pen not to write on paper, but to write on the air. And as he did, his body began to dissolve into pure, dark ink, flowing into the well, joining his comrades. The three essences merged, their individual horrors blending into a new, stable whole. The haunting of Whisperwood ceased. The house became just a house, but the stories remained. And they were waiting for the next chronicler, not to torment, but to test. To find someone who could understand that even the darkest tale needs an ending. Elias wrote the final word. As he did, the figures of William and Joseph dissolved into smoke and were sucked into the ink bottle. The oppressive weight lifted from the house. The air grew warm. The sweet rotten smell was gone, replaced by the simple, honest scent of old wood and dust. He was alone. He corked the ink bottle and placed the pen beside the three completed manuscripts. He was free to go. The house was his, truly his now. But as he walked towards the door, he paused. He looked back at the desk, at the dark bottle. He thought of the power in those stories, the awful, beautiful responsibility. He wasn't sure he would stay, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any ghost, that he would be back. He had finished the stories, but the story of Whisperwood, it seemed, was only just beginning.